Thanks, Megan. So, yeah, the group I work with, the RD&A, is actually it's interagency. So I'm just going to say that, like, I'm Forest Service, but we also have Park Service partners and others from DOI. So it's kind of a great group because we have that combined workforce, so we get perspectives for multiple agencies. And I did also want to acknowledge the IFTDSS team. So this is definitely not me in a silo doing this work. There is a great team involved, and I saw at least Henry and Caroline, who's now retired but still around on the call, and others too. So it's a great team to work with, and this is just one piece of IFTDSS that I was intimately involved with when we kind of worked through it and released it. So I'm glad that I'm able to come here and talk a bit about risk assessments in IFTDSS, and glad that about half of you have used IFTDSS and not as many have done the quantitative risk assessment, which isn't too surprising just because of what it is and it's hard to learn. And we're trying to start getting more materials out there to help people work through this. So this office hour is a great opportunity to just start sharing. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to start with some of the basics about quantitative risk in this talk about scale, and then kind of really dive into IFTDSS with a case study example from real world treatments. So a quantitative wildfire risk assessment, it combines different things. So one aspect is fire behavior modeling, so the likelihood and intensity when fire occurs on the landscape. And then also the effects on the things we care about. So it's not just fire behavior, it's that fire behavior combined with the values and the fire effects associated with it. One thing that I always really like to highlight is with risk assessments, we always think risk negative, but risk assessments also include the benefits of fire. So it's threats and benefits along with it. And yeah. QWRA and the methodology behind the modeling and all the other calculations within it is scalable. So you can really use it at a project level up to a unit or a national forest region, so like statewide or multi-state, and then up to the nation. There's different ways of doing this and different tools that get us the information for this. So IFTDSS was really built with the fuels management planners in mind for kind of project level, so project to unit level. So at this point, what we've done in IFTDSS is most applicable to looking at fuel treatment planning, looking at those alternatives, assessing effectiveness after. It can also be in that project level planning. So maybe you're going to model it for a whole forest and then figure out within what you've got going on where maybe we should put larger projects. And then again, you can use it for that project level planning for treatment effectiveness. It's also, risk assessments are done for regional and national assessments. So they're out there and they're available. So risk monitor is kind of one of those things right now that's a hot topic out there that people are using. There are, like, the Forest Service has a national risk assessment. BLM has done a national risk assessment in the past. Other regions have done it. There's even efforts by states, like the Southeast risk assessments out there. So there's a lot of different existing risk assessments out there. But IFTDSS is really meant for that fuels management planning level. So when we built QWRA and IFTDSS, we really wanted to go to the science. So we built it using the GTR 315, or the Wildfire Risk Assessment Framework for Land Resource Management that Joe Scott and others put together. And I'm going to kind of hit these 4 points multiple times in this talk because it's kind of how we built it in IFTDSS. And it kind of brings in wildfire simulation. We'll go a little deeper on this when I get there, mapping your values. So you actually have to be able to map everything you want to map in a risk assessment to know where they are geospatially. It lets you do an exposure analysis. So that's kind of like, what is the fire hazard where those things are that I care about? And then also there's the full-on risk assessment, and that brings in the information about, like, what are the fire effects? How is fire going to impact the values positively and negatively? Another slide, same 4 points. IFTDSS really built it, and they kind of are building blocks onto each other. So, you have to simulate wildfire before you can do an exposure analysis or a risk assessment. So there are kind of 4 distinct modules within IFTDSS, and they're all a little tied together, but they stand alone. And that's one thing that I think is really powerful about IFTDSS is, like, maybe you just want to look at wildfire hazard and you want to get off the train there. You just want to understand, where is my fire going to occur and how intense is it going to be? Maybe you want to overlay that with a map of your values and you want to set together that value set so you can look at those together. Maybe you actually want to get the analytics from that instead of just a visual, and that's where you go down the exposure analysis. Or maybe you want to go all the way and do that risk assessment. So IFTDSS was built in a way that you can kind of run through the whole way, get to the endpoint, get a risk assessment if that's your goal, or you can do any of the components that lead up to a risk assessment. And it's all still part of a risk assessment. So you don't have to always get all the way to that QWRA, net value change, risk assessment out, but to say you're working with looking at risk within your assessment. And it all just depends on your objectives. So why IFTDSS for QWRA versus some of those other regional national assessments I talked about? There's some key things, like it uses the same sound science. So, we're just as robust as the other ones are, but it's a little different. And it's different because IFTDSS is a great place to learn. Like it's fast, it's flexible. You can get in there, you can hit the buttons. You're probably not going to break anything. If you do, let us know, because that always helps with software development. You can run multiple scenarios. Like look at different values, pull some values for risk assessment, do it, see like random house together, switch your weather around. Like maybe your problem fires typically wind out of the southwest, but what if a cold front passage comes and you're really worried that it's going to come out of the east? Like you can run those pretty quick on your own. You can also do a lot of the stuff for the NEPA process, the treatment alternative, the recording stopped. Okay. Also, in a way, QWRAs and IFTDSS are live. And that means like maybe you have to go back and so the next part on our 4-stage process is those highly valued resources or assets, also known as HVRAs, and IFTDSS is map values. It's just a way of, I guess it's twofold. There's a primary HVRA, which is the Tupperware bins in the image. So that's just a way to group like things together to do the math at the end of the day. And then there's the sub HVRAs, and the sub HVRAs are the maps of the things you care about. So, there's a bunch of resources in IFTDSS. So we have a lot of data out there about like power poles, structures, threatened and endangered species habitat. Like there's a ton of resource data in IFTDSS, but if it doesn't meet your needs, or if you have better data local, you can upload your own. So it is totally flexible with like, there's either the easy button, like use the data we have, and then there are data feeds that are current, accurate, and they're like from the source, or bring your own in. So sometimes I've worked with like tribal entities and none of that's public. So they have to bring their own to the system. And when you bring it to the system, it's only you that can see it. So it's not like suddenly it's available for everyone, which I've had that question before. Just kind of a shot of we're to our Scatterlands landscape. So this was again on the Idaho Panhandles. It was part of a shared stewardship effort from the Forest Service. So it's actually treating Forest Service land and private land together to try and meet some of our risk reduction goals. So for them, the things of concern were communities. So home structures, et cetera, infrastructure. So things like comm towers, power lines, surface drinking water, just availability of that and quality, and then ecosystem function. So ecosystem function is actually another thing that is really tied to LANDFIRE. It's based on biophysical setting and expected fire effects. So there's areas within that are like, all right, fire is going to be totally positive, totally negative, trending one towards the other, et cetera. There's a lot of documentation about it within our help system. And it was created for the Forest Service National Wildfire Risk Assessment, but it's applicable everywhere. It's not just Forest Service lands. All right, so an exposure assessment. So once you've run your models, your burn probability, you've created your map values, now you can actually go to the exposure analysis. And basically what it does is it's a summary of those fire behavior outputs being your burn probability, flame length, and integrated hazard, where your sub-HVRAs are present. So it basically is a big GIS smush. Like, all right, I have this HVRA here. These are the results of my fire behavior or fire metrics. So IFTDSS has, you can see it in a map, which is kind of on the right. That's looking at the moderate to high surface drinking water area. And then on the left is kind of like the charts of it. So those are all 3 levels. And it's the burn probability, average burn probability over all the pixels that fall into those different categories on the top. And then conditional flame length is on the bottom. And that moderate to high area is the far right bar. So it shows you too that if I look at exposure, my low importance surface drinking water is the least likely to burn, and it has the lowest flame lengths. So this is one point where you could pause and think about, okay, if I want to do my treatment scenarios, where do I want to put them? And a lot of that goes back to your objectives, how important things are, what you want to do. You may want to concentrate more effort on that moderate to high importance watershed just to reduce the risk to that. Because it's probably a little more important to you, which we'll get to when we get to the relative importance part. So that's kind of one way with an exposure analysis. You can start to look at the maps and the numbers and think about, if I have limited resources, what should I target to do my treatments? So then next, we're moving to the risk assessment, and there's a couple other bits of data that a user needs to bring to the table. The first is the response functions. So this correlates fire behavior and fire effects to the values you care about. So you have to think about, how is fire going to impact it if it burns through? Is it going to be like the best thing since sliced bread? Okay, that's a plus 100. Like fire at this level, so from like 0 to 2 feet flame lengths, fire is amazing for this value. I'm going to say it's 100. Or is it total loss? And that would be a negative 100. So that could be the inverse. Flame lengths of 0 to 2 feet, horrible. I'm going to make it negative 100. Or there's a spread in between. And that's why I brought in one of the images of the different ecosystem functions. Like, not everything is always red, not everything's always green. It can be a mix of the two. So the way the response functions are usually done is in a workshop. And this is something I should have said early on. Like, the risk assessment process is very collaborative. Like, you shouldn't do this in a silo, bringing your own information in alone. It's a lot of conversations. It's a lot of communication. It's a lot of give and take. Like, at the end of the day, to hit the buttons in IFTDSS, great, do that, but do that with information you gained in workshops. Typically, to do the response functions, you have resource specialists. So if you're going to say, how does fire affect wildlife habitat, you should probably have a wildlife biologist there, for example. If it's something about water, maybe you have a hydrologist or a fisheries biologist or someone else in the room, along with a fire person, because I think the fire person is always important to that. Yeah, and it's a lot of coming back, discussing, realigning, etc. For the national HVRA data set that we have in there right now, response functions are assigned, but you can edit them. But a lot of them, like if you bring your own data to the table, or if it's one of the resources in IFTDSS that isn't tied to that specific data set, it's a blank canvas. So there is a lot of discussion and thinking. And just because one resource function is assigned to, like, we'll say a power pole and, I don't know, one ecosystem versus another, they don't always have to be identical. So it's hard to have a firm set library, let's say, if there's response functions to use. But you can look at past risk assessments to get a better idea. The next bit is the relative importance. So this is usually done with like a line officer or someone else versus the one who's passionate about their resource, because of course it's always the most important thing. And it's really challenging. Like, you have to rank the different values you have in kind of an order of importance. There can be ties, but there always has to be like one that's 100 within it. And it just helps tease out in the calculations behind the scenes. Like, it makes certain things pop out more. Like, if everything is even, your risk assessment is going to look different than if you say, like, no, actually communities are more important to me than surface drinking water. So it just really helps it's an integral part to the risk assessment process. Just like with the response functions, this definitely needs to be done in a group setting, and it's not always one and done. It can be iterative. So you just want to review, critique, refine, and work your way to a solid relative importance. So once you get that all together, it's, again, you're bringing in that likelihood and intensities from fire behavior modeling, plus the susceptibility, which is the response functions, and the importance, which is the relative importance, together to do some gnarly math in the background, which is great that IFTDSS automates this for you. And it gets you net value change or risk. Those are interchangeable terminology. There's kind of two versions of that, or two flavors. One is conditional and one is expected. The conditional assumes a fire happens, so it basically takes likelihood out of the equation. versus the expected is it keeps that likelihood or burn probability within it. And they can be used to fine tune slightly different questions with it. For the next few slides, I use the conditional just to show maps and talk about it with it. So this is kind of one of the outputs. So this is conditional weighted net value change. Deeper reds in the map mean it's a higher threat, which means it fires bad. Deeper greens mean it's a benefit. White means it wasn't either threat or benefit. It was neutral, which does happen. And this is the combination of all those values smushed together on top of each other. So you might have like ecosystem function over a watershed and a tower. It takes the math from all three of those, puts it together, and gives you one pixel. So it's kind of, in a way, like combining that burn probability and conditional flame length into hazard. It just takes all the information and gives you one answer at the end of the day. So this map could be used too for planning. Like I'm looking at it and I see a lot of green. So maybe when I start doing my fuel treatment planning, instead of waiting for a wildfire to come to get fire in the landscape, maybe I actually implement prescribed burns in those areas if it's within flame lengths that I think are reasonable. Or maybe if a wildfire comes, I don't take direct suppression action in those areas. Or if it's really red, that means there's a value there that's red. Maybe I start thinking about putting some fuel treatments to either lessen the red in that area or buffer nearby so fire doesn't get as far into that red area. There's also some of the charts that come out with an IFTDSS report. So the one below the image is kind of just the breakdown of pixels across the landscape within it. And then the ones on the right are kind of tricky to show, but it shows like the fact that there is threat and benefit because of that overlapping area for all of our values. So if I look at the first big bar where it's really orange, like that's the low density population. So that is our most like threat area within the landscape, but there is still a little benefit. You see that little blue on the right tail. So it tells you in that area, so low density homes and communities, like that's one of our areas that has the highest threat. So it's really likely to burn. It's going to burn hot and it's going to burn it with negative effects. So that also could clue you on like maybe I need to go in and concentrate effort around those low density communities to reduce risk there. That may be a place to put my treatments and target it. All right, so now I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit to the real world example. So and just trying to show like we have treatments, we applied them within IFTDSS, they also applied them on the ground. How did it impact risk? How did it change things? So this was a multi-year project. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it was on the Idaho Panhandle National Forest. It was part of a shared stewardship. So there are like pockets of forest which are kind of collide where trees are. So the black, they've actually done treatments already, and you can see the types of treatments they did on the bottom there within the project area. And they also had some treatments that were done outside in red. And I'm just bringing that up because it's kind of important when you do these landscape edits to have a bigger view than your project area. Go and think on your project area, look at disturbance Irish landscape, and a change you make outside might impact areas in your project more than you realize. So we basically use tools within IFTDSS landscape around. And the idea is now to look at how effective will these treatments be at reducing risk if there is a problem fire this year. So it's existing conditions and then this post-treated landscape to look at. So it's just one alternative side by side, but you could build this out more for future planning. And I do want to say before I go to the next slide, this is just the first year of treatment, and you can see like the black blobs. It's a really small part of the landscape, so I wouldn't expect a big change. And that's kind of where this slide comes in. And this is one of those things that can be a little bit of a head scratcher. It's hard to communicate. So if I look at that whole project area, which looks like a weird Northeast US, there's not a lot of change. So I'm looking at, from those treatments I did, I'm looking at maybe a 3% reduction at the highest level. So in these charts, the top one for the next series, the top one is our existing conditions. And then the bottom one is the post-treatment. And I'm looking at integrated hazard here. So red again is more hazardous, blue is less. So I'm just looking at the shift from higher hazard to lower hazard throughout it. So on the bottom right, I can see I reduced my highest class by 1%, the next by 2%. And those then are seen in the lower categories. So it was, maybe a 3% difference across that whole project area, which maybe isn't the best, but it's reality. But then if I look just in the treatment, so then I pulled a report in IFTDSS that just looked within those treatment areas. The treatments are making a difference where they are. So you're seeing it more than a 20% decrease in those highest classes, shifting to the low to middle classes. So I mean, your treatments are effectively reducing hazard where they are, and they are making an impact on the whole project area. And then again, I'm looking at shifts for the overall risk between the two. I didn't put the arrows to show it so much, but you can see I'm actually shifting from about 35% of this higher benefit to 48. So some of my treatments are also forwarding the benefits of fire, and they're reducing risks too at the same time. So prior I had like 38% in those treatment footprints were the higher threat, and that's jumped down to 27%. So we are shifting from some threat to some benefit by doing these treatments. So they are definitely effective. And then again, looking at those side-by-side ones, let's look at the individual sub-HVRAs. Existing conditions are on the left, treated are on the right. And you can just see, like, without me going into deep detail about it, you can see the shifting of those orange and those blue bars side by side. So you're not only impacting like the net value change across the landscape, you're also really impacting individual sub-HVRAs. And that can give you an indication if your treatment's kind of meeting your objectives to lower risk for whatever you want or increase benefit for whatever you want. So with that, I just always have to give a shout out to the IFTDSS help and the team. Like, they're absolutely amazing. Like, the help system has a whole section on quantitative risk assessment, a lot for the button pushing. They've also are getting lots of things into the Wildland Fire learning portal for self-learning. Like, if you're new to IFTDSS, which it sounds like half you are, there's modules there to get you up and get running, and you can learn. There's a ton of webinars. There's a forum, so you can ask other users what's going on. You can submit tickets. You can ask questions. Like, our team is here to really promote and help the users of IFTDSS. So it's a great group to work with and a great tool to have in your back pocket. And with that, that's what I had.
Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah.
I'm just going to have you keep sharing your screen because we might need to go back to some of your slides if that's okay.
Yeah.
And folks, now is the time to put I see a couple questions coming in. Nicole, can you see the chat window right now?
I'm trying to find it again.
Okay, no worries. I'm going to read the question, or if you want to read the question out loud so that we can keep the question for our recording for our YouTube video, to make sure that we're capturing them all. But I'll read the first question. Bradley asks, where is IFTDSS? Oops, sorry, my thing is moving. Lots of questions. This is great. Okay, so where is IFTDSS gathering the post-treatment condition information modeling, what it assumes will be there after the noted treatment or an actual follow-up measurement?
Yeah, so that's actually something the user does. So IFTDSS doesn't do it. So we have different editing tools within IFTDSS. Currently, with the Landfire that we have, it's basically like conditional editing. So you say if it was a fuel model 165, post-treatment it's a 181, my treatment increased canopy, or yeah, increased canopy cover by 15%, etc. So there is that editing. We are working actively with University of Idaho and others to update our default treatment rules. So those are kind of the cores based on the Landfire total fuel change tool. We had those available until they did remap, and remap kind of made it so those weren't applicable anymore. So we're working on doing that too. And those kind of tie to like disturbance type and severity. So low severity wildfire is great for prescribed fire, and it uses a bunch of state and transition modeling in the background to understand, like, if I did a prescribed fire last year, what's it going to be this year, all the way up to like, I think it's 10 years out. So yeah.
Great. Andy asks, was the only difference between pre and post treatment the FBFM, or were there other changes?
Yeah, good question, Andy. So for this specifically, there were other changes. We changed both the fuel model and the canopy characteristics, which I think is really important if you're doing any kind of fuel treatment on the ground that does that. Like you need that for the whole picture because changes in canopy characteristics change fire behavior as well as those changes in the fire behavior fuel model. So like I mentioned earlier with um, canopy closure. Like if suddenly you have more open canopy, winds are going to be faster. That could kick up your flame lengths. That could change your fire behavior. If you're able to do a thinning of like lower diameter trees and you're lifting that canopy base height, you're going to reduce your chance of crown fire. So it's really important when you do that. And we actually have, I believe it's in the learning portal. We have information on how to edit landscapes. If not, it's definitely in the FDDS help to kind of a guideline for that because we get a lot of questions about editing.
Carrie, I'm going to answer your question about the LF 2024 data for CONUS. LF 2024 is released staggered throughout the year. So I'm going to put the link to the schedule in the chat window so you can see when your area of interest is going to be coming out. Leonardo asks, is it important to buffer out your area of interest by a set distance to account for wildfire spreading in? If so, how far should you buffer by?
Yeah, that's a great question, Leonardo. You should. And Nifty just does that for you. So whenever you pull in a landscape, it was kind of like in one of my images. Let me see if I can go up to that slide without scrolling way past it. So yeah, so in this landscape, you'll see like there's this turquoise box. That's the area that I actually drew in the tool. And then Ifty just goes out another 5 kilometers, and that's to that black area. So it always adds at least a 5 kilometer buffer to allow for that. But you could always draw that turquoise box even smaller to give yourself a bigger buffer around it. And a lot of that's to allow those fires to spread onto and off of the area you're modeling without getting edge effects. Because if you just clip it, and model it to the end, they kind of hit the end and do some funky things within the model. So yeah, that was a great question. And we did a lot of work with SMEs to figure out 5 kilometers given the model we're using. You probably want that bigger for something like FSIM.
Just a side note, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to just come off mute and make sure that you get those questions answered. Sarah, would you mind launching the poll before we go much further? If there's a poll that's going to come up on your screen, please take that before you leave. Jim Smith asks, what enhancements or improvements are expected in the near to midterm?
Yeah. So for IFTDSS, one of those is those landscape editing rules I talked about. Like that is on our short list to add to help for functionality. And this one's a little hard because I'm not fully embedded with the team anymore. They've talked about doing some work with collaboration, so you could share resources across different users. And other than that, a lot of it's just software updates, which aren't fun, but are necessary. So I think that's like in the shorter term. We've talked about adding fire effects models in the longer term picture, and want to build out some of the last slides I showed to compare. Like right now, that was just running one, running the other, and putting them together. We actually want to build a compare module into that so it can be automated for you to look at the differences in risk and stuff. So those are some of the things on the docket. Yeah, and I see Bree is on too, and she's typing things and cleaning up behind me. So thank you, Bree. She's the lead of the project.
And Henry is our lead. He said future enhancements. We've talked about doing work with FOFEM and smoke.
Yeah, so FOFM is one of those first order fire effects models. So that's one of the ones we're working with the fire lab to incorporate.
Great. Shiming asks, are there considerations for incorporating other fire effects in addition to flame length, such as rate of spread in the integrated hazard calculation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it actually is. So burn probability really relies a lot on rate of spread. So when you simulate a wildfire, it basically is one fire you allow to burn, so it spreads across the landscape under the conditions for the set amount of time you have. And obviously higher rates of spread result in a bigger footprint. And then all of those tens of thousands of fires are overlaid with each other to get your burn probability. So it is with an integrated hazard via the burn probability output right now.
Rebecca asks, can you talk about a bit about editing landscapes outside of IFTDIS using Python or masks in ArcPro and uploading them into IFTDIS. Will that still work for running post-treatment risk assessments?
Yeah, Rebecca. So about a year ago, I think, IFTY just added the ability for you to upload your own landscapes into the system to use for modeling. So you could absolutely do that. You can grab your initial one from Landfire if you want, either within IFTDIS, or you could go like to the data distribution center, or if you have your own data from a totally different resource, you can bring that in for existing conditions. You can edit outside IFTDIS and bring that up too. So yeah, that was a big enhancement that was added about a year ago that opens up like the door to more than Landfire data, but Landfire seems to still be the core data that's available everywhere that most people use. Yeah.
Boone has a little bit of a comment and then a question. It's well researched that less than 20% of structure ignitions is caused by direct flame impingement, and 80 to 90% is caused by short range ember fallout. QWRA quantifies hazard by using flame length. While this may work decently in fuels and canopy, do you think there is room to define hazard to structures using potential crowning to quantify hazard to homes to improve accuracy instead of flame length?
Ooh, Boone, that's a hard one, and I know you. That may be a little outside of my realm to answer accurately, but I will say that the modeling within IFTY just does include spotting. So you get to set your spotting level, and that just ties to fire spread throughout. Um, yeah, as far as structure stuff, I am going to be like, I don't know enough about it. And a lot of times too, with the Landfire data, it's non-burnable.
Sorry to
Uh,
put you on the spot, Nicole.
yeah, so I was like,
I
oh,
just thought I'd throw it
Bone.
out there. I sort of want to make people aware of it too, because I think people easily, assume that because flames happen, the home burned down, but
Yeah.
that's not the case. And it's like, boy, it would be nice to be able to move to that next step.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's great about FTDS is as the science changes, like it can incorporate new fire behavior modeling, et cetera. I don't know if we're there yet for that specific question. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well, just the transition to crown gives you such a better output if you're trying to really look at the vulnerability of homes to wildfire.
Yeah, and you could actually run the landscape fire behavior model that has the crown fire potential and look
Yeah,
at your map values. So you can look at them together in that respect. It wouldn't take you down the QWRA route, but it is a great way to look at it. So good
yeah,
point.
yeah.
Yeah,
I feel like it's a much better metric.
yeah.
Cool.
Thanks, Boone. Bradley asks, does the ability to work with outside data landscapes have an ability to work with Lidar pre and post treatment data or not yet?
So direct LiDAR, no, but if you can use the LiDAR to build that landscape file, you can totally bring it within. And that is something that like is totally possible. I worked on my dissertation eons ago with some LiDAR data, and I actually built landscapes to do all this modeling within the FlameMap desktop ecosystem. So absolutely doable. You just need to get the topography information from your DEM. You need to do some kind of assessment to get a fire behavior fuel model associated with it. And then you can use the LiDAR direct to get your canopy characteristics like cover height, base height, bolt density, etc. Yeah. And it just can bring in landscapes of I think 1 meter to 270 meter resolution. So you can be really fine scale if you have that LiDAR data, but there are limits on like data file sizes. So I can't remember how big, but X number of megabytes, gigabytes, whatever. So you can't go 12 million acres with a 1 meter landscape. It won't let you do that.
I'm not seeing any come up yet. Nicole, where are you based out of?
Oh yeah, that would have helped. I'm in Bend, Oregon, so
Okay.
Central Oregon. Yeah, and I've worked with the RD&A since 2017. So I was involved with the IFTDIS project till 2021. And then after that, I kind of switched over and I now lead our fire modeling services framework project, which is kind of the powerhouse engine behind IFTDIS to run all the models. So when you set a model off, it behind the scenes, IFTDIS packages it up and sends it over to the project I work on. We run the simulation and send it back. And it was also the model behind WFDIS NextGen, which launched today. So it's a pretty exciting thing for our group within the RD&A. So the WFDIS, as we know, it is no more, and the new version is out, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's exciting. We have Sam Amato coming on to give our office hour to talk about that in a month or two. So thanks for reminding me.
Yeah.
And Brianna just posted the tutorial about editing in the chat window if anybody wants to check that out.
Thanks, Bri. I knew it was somewhere in all of our help. I just can't remember where.
Well, it's not quite the link to the tutorial. I didn't get quite that far, but it's in the learning portal, and I'll put a link to the learning portal so you can log in and find it there. And our help content has links to a lot of this stuff too for additional learning.
Perfect.
And both those things, I should say, IFTDSS is available to anybody. So it's, agency, not private. There's a lot of academic users. And then so is the Wildland Fire Learning Portal. Like, you need to set up accounts, but it's like, it's not just, you don't have to be a federal person. Like, anyone can get into either of these, and they're both great resources. Yeah, and Kim's putting on there, she did a great webinar on landscape editing. So there's a lot of resources there.
Howard asks, have you noticed that if using high resolution, such as Lidar over OTC Landfire products, increases confidence in a meaningful way to justify the effort?
That's a really good question. So you always want to have the best data available to run your models. And the best data available means it represents the landscape or the piece of ground you're concerned with. But the models are only so sensitive to things. So, we always recommend with any data you use, Landfire or even Lidar, like, do some ground truthing, understand what it's doing, seeing if it's correct, and then doing a lot of calibration on the modeling side too. Because again, models are a representation of reality, and they're not always perfect, they're not always accurate, but there are ways that you can work through it to make them more accurate and make them more true to what you're seeing on the ground. And fire behavior, for what we're talking about at the end of the day, is the metric you're most concerned about. I've done some work unrelated to this project looking at the two, and using custom fuel models and other stuff. Sometimes there is benefit to doing it, but again, it also takes the calibration side on the modeler. So yes, but always be sure of what you're looking at. And I guess it just depends on, what you consider the effort is with it.
Rebecca has a question, playing off of Boone's previous question. Can you unpack why the spotting probability was set at 20% and good resources to inform any local adjustments?
Yeah, so that one was done with a bunch of other subject matter experts or SMEs relating to the model. So we kind of found that 20% is a good threshold to get enough spotting moving forward for the simulation type we're doing. So if you were to use a different model like Farsight, you'd actually really want that a lot lower. And some of that ties to how the spotting module works within these models. And that's just kind of a sweet spot to start with. But a lot of it is, again, it comes back to like understanding your fire behavior and calibration. Like, you shouldn't really start with just a landscape burn probability. You should do, the landscape fire behavior flame map model first. And then you should move to the MTT fire spread or MTT. And that's where you start doing that 2D fire spread across the landscape, and do it based on conditions you know about. Like, see wildfires, look at events, see how fast it's spreading, look at rate of spread, look at the intensity. It may be something that you look at your ecosystem and your vegetation type. Like, maybe you're in an area that's thick lodgepole that you're modeling and 20% is not enough. Maybe you're somewhere that's like really open ponderosa pine, and maybe it's not really 20%. Like, so it's kind of thinking about fire behavior and your vegetation out there to kind of fine tune those inputs. Yeah.
Thanks, Nicole. Any other questions?
Barking dog, sorry.
Just a reminder to everybody that this recording will be on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. So if you want to rewatch it, you'll have that ability in 24 hours.
Nicole, did you hit on the question about weather inputs? There was a question about, just briefly talk about the weather data used in the risk modeling.
Oh, shoot. No, I didn't. Yeah, so with the quantitative wildfire risk assessments, you really want it to be that problem fire scenario. So it's kind of like the higher, if you use percentiles, it's like 90th percentile or higher when you do it. Or it's like you mentioned earlier, the fire that keeps you awake at night. Either it hasn't happened yet, like super dry, super windy, winds out of like the southwest. So those are kind of the information you put in there. So you can either do like a climatology assessment with the Fire Family Plus database with data from FEMS these days, or expert opinion, or like, hey, we had this fire that blew up. Like, what were the conditions that made it blow up that day? Like, there was a fire that I was actually working this summer, and it did a 4,000 acre run when no one really expected it to, up on the Cascade Crest. Like, so I could dig in and be like, all right, that fire was here local. I'm doing a risk assessment for the local unit. What led to that? What were the fuel moistures? What was the wind speed? What was the wind direction? So all that kind of information can come into it. Yeah. Yeah, the user at this point inputs the stuff for IFTDSS runs.
Ximing had brought this to our attention. Could you please briefly talk about the weather data used in the risk modeling, for example, gridded or not source and resolution?
Oh, so it is that the user brings the data to the table. So it's information you bring. You could derive that from gridded, you could derive that from raws, or like I said, you could derive it from expert opinion.
Jason asks, any advice and cautions for users who might try to compare their IFTDSS QWRA results to other assessments?
Yeah. Some cautions are fuzzy eyes. Red is bad, green is good, usually in most of the assessments, but we're using different models at the core of it. So really you can't do a direct comparison with a risk assessment that was modeled with, say, FSIM, because FSIM runs many, many days with variable weather versus the landscape burn probability is like 1 to 2-ish burn periods with constant weather. So you're going to get pretty different outputs just because if it's constant weather, your fire is always kind of tracking in one way. So if your wind's out of the southwest, you're always going to have fires going this way. Versus if it's something from FSIM, it can kind of do all the crazy shifts, or FS Pro if you're going to go that route too. So yeah, I would look for general trends that are similar, like higher risk areas should kind of track similarly in the two, but you can't do a side-by-side one-to-one comparison just because you're using different models at the core of it. And I do see the next one. Did the models translate well to non-forested communities? They do. Whether or not you go for full-on risk is always a good question. Like a lot of times folks talk about just doing the exposure for like kind of non-forested dominated ecosystems because of the fire effects. Like it's on or it's off. You know, it's fully consuming grass and shrubs or it's not. Like at that point, do the flame lengths matter so much? Maybe not. So you can look more at just exposure to your values in those ecosystems. And that's kind of something I found working some with folks in Idaho and areas where it's less forested, for example.